Before I knew my own name, I knew the names of the 88 keys on a grand piano. My childhood was not measured in birthdays or school years, but in sonatas, concertos, and endless grueling hours of practice. I was a prodigy, a little miracle in a velvet dress, but my gift was not my own. It was a magnificent tyrannical beast, and my father was its keeper. He was a man possessed by the ghost of his own failed ambitions, a concert pianist who never was, and he saw in me his second chance, his vicarious shot at immortality. He would stand over me at the piano, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity, and as my small, aching hands flew across the keys, he would repeat his mantra, the words that became the bars of my gilded cage. "Your hands are not your own, Lillian," he would say, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "They do not belong to you to play with dolls or make mud pies. They belong to the music. They belong to Beethoven, to Chopin, to God." He never knew that for years I secretly prayed that the music, this great and terrible God, would one day give them back. He never knew that the hands he claimed for his ambition would one day orchestrate my own quiet, defiant escape. Greetings to you all, my dear friends. My name is Lillian, and I am 75 years old. I'm so happy to welcome you into my small sunlit music studio. It's a very different kind of studio from the one I grew up in. As you can see, there are no intimidating portraits of stern-faced composers on the walls. Instead, there are colorful drawings by my students and a large board covered in gold and silver star stickers. The metronome, the tyrant of my youth, is tucked away on a high shelf collecting dust. Here, we do not worship at the altar of perfection. We make a joyful noise. I am a piano teacher for young children, and my life's work now is to give them the one thing that was, so meticulously stolen from me, the simple, uncomplicated joy of creating music for its own sake. We learn nursery rhymes and popular songs, we bang on the keys, we make mistakes, and we laugh. I teach my students that their hands are their own and that the greatest music they can make is the music that makes them happy. It is a profound joy to share this space with you today. It feels like a testament to how far a life can travel. I would be so interested to know where you are all watching from. Please leave a comment below and tell me your city or country. And I have a question for you. Did you have a hobby or a passion as a child? Was it something you did for the pure fun of it, or did you feel the pressure to be the best? The line between passion and pressure can be so thin. And if you find a connection in our time together, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories of reclamation find an audience, and it warms this old teacher's heart more than you know. My story begins with the ghost of my father's dream. Richard Vance was a man of immense talent and even greater ambition, but he lacked the one thing a concert pianist needs, the unbreakable nerve. His career had been a short, sputtering flame, extinguished by a disastrous debut in a minor concert hall in his early 20s. He never touched the piano again for himself, but the ghost of that failure haunted our small apartment, a bitter, silent presence. When I was born, he saw not a daughter, but a vessel, a chance to relaunch his dream. The moment of my anointing, the moment my childhood was officially sacrificed to his ambition, came when I was 4 years old. I had wandered over to the old, neglected upright piano in our living room and, with one finger, had perfectly picked out the melody of a lullaby my mother sang to me. I remember looking up and seeing my father in the doorway. His face, usually a mask of quiet, simmering disappointment, was transformed. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. He looked as though he had just seen a religious apparition. He didn't smile, he didn't rush over to hug me. He simply walked to the piano, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed my tiny hands on the keys. "Again," he commanded, his voice trembling with a strange, feverish excitement. That was the beginning. From that day forward, my life was no longer my own. It was a rigorous, relentless training regimen designed to forge me into the prodigy he needed me to be. My days became a blur of structured, isolating work. While other children were learning to read in kindergarten, I was learning music theory. While they were playing in the park, I was practicing scales for 6, 7, 8 hours a day until my small fingers were numb and my back ached. The metronome became the soundtrack to my life, its merciless rhythmic ticking, a constant reminder that I was a fraction too slow, a beat behind perfection. My father was my only teacher, and he was a brutal taskmaster. Every mistake was met with a sharp, disappointed sigh or a cold, cutting critique. "No, Lillian, that's sentimental. Play it with the fire it demands." Or, "Your fingering is sloppy. Do it again and again and again." There was no praise, only a relentless pursuit of a flawless ideal he had set in his mind. My mother, a gentle but timid woman, was swept up in his obsession. She became our manager, our scheduler, our publicist. She was the one who sewed my little velvet performance dresses, who booked the small church halls for my first recitals, who spoke in hushed, reverent tones to the local newspaper about her gifted child. I think she saw the exhaustion in my eyes, the way my shoulders slumped over the keyboard. But she was a willing accomplice to my father's dream. She, too, had been disappointed by his failure, and my success was a way for her to finally have the life of glamour and importance she had once imagined. They were a team, and I was their Project Dot. The isolation was absolute. I was not allowed to have friends, friendships were a distraction, and other children carried germs that could jeopardize a performance. I was tutored at home, my curriculum stripped of everything my father deemed frivolous. There was no art, no history, only mathematics for rhythm and structure, and languages for the opera librettos. I remember once, when I was about 9, a family with a girl my age moved in next door. I would watch her from my window as she played outside, riding her bike, laughing with her friends. The longing I felt was a physical pain. One afternoon, I begged my father to let me go outside and play with her just for half an hour. He looked at me, his face a mask of profound disappointment. "Play, he said, as if I had spoken a foreign language. "Lillian, ordinary children play. You are not an ordinary child. You have a gift from God. To waste even a single hour of practice on something as trivial as playing is a sin. Greatness requires sacrifice." Now from the top, the Chopin Etude, and this time with feeling. My public life began when I was 8. I was trotted out at local music clubs and small competitions. I was a sensation, the little girl with the serious face and the impossibly fast fingers. I won every competition I entered. But the memory of these triumphs is not one of joy. It's a memory of blinding stage lights, the suffocating scent of my mother's perfume, and the terrifying, intense pressure of my father's gaze from the wings, his lips silently moving along with the music, his entire body tense with a vicarious, desperate ambition. After each performance, there would be no hug, no, "I'm so proud of you." There would only be a clinical, post-mortem analysis of my performance in the car ride home. "Your allegro was a bit rushed in the third movement," he would say, "and you hesitated for a fraction of a second before the coda. We will work on that tomorrow." My hands, the source of this gift, became alien things to me. They were not a part of my body. They were a pair of highly trained, valuable instruments that belonged to my father. They were insured for a vast sum of money. I was not allowed to do anything that might endanger them. I couldn't cut my own food. I couldn't open a jar. I couldn't play with our cat for fear of a scratch. They were swaddled in gloves when I went outside and massaged with special creams every night. They were the tools of his trade, and I was just the silent, obedient machine to which they were attached. The pressure continued to build, my world shrinking until it consisted of nothing but 88 black and white keys. By the time I was 12, I was no longer a local phenomenon. My father, with his relentless drive, had secured a powerful manager in New York. I had a recording contract. I was a name whispered with awe in the classical music world. To everyone else, I was living a fairy tale, a life of glamour and applause. In reality, I was the loneliest girl in the world, a well-cared-for racehorse, trotted out to perform and then put back in my stall Dot. The moment that felt like the final locking of my cage door came when I was 13. I was practicing in our new, much larger apartment in New York City, a place bought with the earnings from my hands. My father came into the music room, his face alight with a look of messianic fervor I had learned to dread. He was holding a concert program. "We've done it, Lillian," he said, his voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "This is it, the moment we have worked for." He handed me the program. On the cover, under the iconic, world-famous name of the venue, was a large black-and-white photograph of me. It was a picture of a serious, unsmiling 13-year-old girl, and beneath it, the words, "An Evening with Lillian Vance, the Carnegie Hall debut." I looked at my own face, at the name of that hallowed, terrifying stage, and I felt no excitement, no pride. All I felt was the crushing, unbearable weight of my father's dream, a dream that was about to be tested on the biggest stage in the world, a dream where I was the star, but also, I was beginning to fear, the inevitable sacrifice. The months leading up to the Carnegie Hall debut were not a period of artistic preparation. They were a systematic, dehumanizing process of creating a perfect machine. The pressure, which had been a constant, heavy blanket about my childhood, now became a crushing, suffocating weight. My father's obsession intensified, his eyes taking on the feverish, haunted look of a man gambling his entire soul on a single night. Our New York apartment was no longer a home in any sense of the word. It was a high-pressure training facility. My practice schedule was increased to a grueling 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. I would wake before dawn, my hands already stiff and aching, and I would be at the piano playing scales as the sun rose over the city I was never allowed to explore. My day was a relentless cycle of practice, a short, silent meal, and more practice, until I would fall into bed, my mind a chaotic swirl of musical notes, too exhausted to dream. My father was no longer just a teacher, he was a conductor, and I was his unwilling, solitary orchestra. He sought not my interpretation, but my perfect execution of his. He would stand beside the piano for hours, a scowl etched on his face, stopping me for the slightest perceived flaw. "No, Lillian, that's not it," he would snap, his voice sharp as a whip. "The rubato there is self-indulgent. It's weak. You must be a vessel for the music, not an interpreter. Play what the composer wrote, what I am telling you to play." My own musical instincts, the small, tentative ideas I had about phrasing or dynamics, were systematically crushed. I was being hollowed out, my own artistry scraped away to make room for his. The music, which had once been a source of complex fascination, became a tyrannical language I was forced to speak, a series of commands to be flawlessly obeyed. The outside world was represented by a new figure in our lives, a slick, fast-talking manager named Arthur Wexler. He was a man who saw music not as an art, but as a commodity. He and my father would have long, hushed conversations in the evenings, speaking a language of contracts, box office percentages, and publicity tours. They spoke of me as if I were a prize racehorse, a valuable asset to be managed. "We need to protect the hands," I heard Wexler say one night. "No solid foods she has to cut herself. No unnecessary risks." They controlled my diet, my sleep schedule, my entire physical existence. I was no longer a person, I was a project, a brand, a pair of insured hands attached to a girl whose own feelings were an inconvenient variable in their grand equation. My mother, bless her heart, tried to be a source of comfort, but her comfort was part of the problem. She would bring me warm milk to help me sleep, she would fuss over the velvet gowns for the performance, she would tell me how proud she was, and how all of Europe would soon know my name. She saw my exhaustion, but she interpreted it as the noble suffering of a great artist, not the quiet desperation of a child prisoner. "All the greats have to sacrifice, darling," she'd say, fluffing my pillows. "It will all be worth it when you hear that applause." She couldn't understand that the applause was the sound I was beginning to dread most, the roar of 1,000 strangers celebrating my imprisonment. My one and only attempt at rebellion during this time was a pathetic, dismal failure. After a 10-hour session working on a fiendishly difficult Liszt passage, my hands were cramping and my vision was blurry with exhaustion. My father demanded I play it one more time. I snapped. "No," I said, the word a small cracked sound in the silent room. "I can't. My hands hurt." My father looked at me, his face not angry but filled with a deep theatrical wound. "Your hands hurt?" he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Do you think Beethoven's hands didn't hurt when he was composing the Ninth Symphony, deaf and alone? Do you think Chopin didn't suffer? This pain is the price of admission to immortality, Lillian. To complain about it is to spit on the gift God has given us." He made my exhaustion into a moral failing, my physical pain into a spiritual weakness. I was selfish. I was ungrateful. I played the passage again, my tears silently dripping onto the ivory keys. The night of the debut arrived like a death sentence. The backstage area of Carnegie Hall was a hushed, sacred space, but to me, it felt like the antechamber to the gallows. I sat in my dressing room, a 13-year-old girl drowning in a sea of dark green velvet, while my mother fussed with my hair and my father paced the floor like a caged tiger. Wexler popped his head in. "Full house, kid, not an empty seat. They're buzzing out there, don't screw it up." I felt a wave of nausea. I remember looking at my hands. They didn't feel like my own, they were pale alien things, tools that were about to be put to work. My father knelt before me. He took my hands in his. His were cold and clammy. "This is it," he whispered, his eyes burning with a terrifying fire. "This is for all the sacrifices, for my dream, for your future. Do not disappoint me." Then I was walking down a long, dim hallway towards a brilliant rectangle of light. I heard the roar of the crowd, a vast, inhuman sound. I walked onto the stage and the world disappeared into a blinding white glare. I bowed, a mechanical, doll-like gesture. I sat at the enormous gleaming black piano. For a moment, there was a profound, absolute silence. I looked out into the darkness and saw 1,000 indistinct faces, a sea of expectation. I saw my father standing in the wings, his hands clenched, his entire body rigid. I placed my hands on the keys, and then I disappeared. The performance was an out-of-body experience. The music flowed, a torrent of technically perfect, dazzlingly complex notes. I played Rachmaninoff and Liszt, pieces of immense power and passion, but I felt nothing. It was as if my hands were disconnected from my soul, performing a series of breathtakingly complex calculations that had no emotional meaning. I was a puppet, and my father from the wings was pulling the strings. When the final crashing chord echoed into the vast hall, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the world erupted. The applause was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that washed over me. The audience was on its feet, shouting, "Brava!" Flowers rained down on the stage. It was a triumph, a sensation. The critics would later write of the astonishing maturity, the flawless technique, the birth of a legend. I took my bows, the puppet performing its final required gestures. Backstage, it was a scene of pandemonium. Wexler was ecstatic, talking about a world tour. My mother was weeping with joy. My father grabbed me, his face flushed with a wild, possessive pride. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "We did it." He was celebrating his victory. I just stood there, in the center of the storm, feeling completely and utterly hollow, an empty vessel from which all the music had been poured. The roar of the applause was still ringing in my ears, but it sounded like the roar of a distant, hungry lion. The success at Carnegie Hall was not a liberation, it was the final closing of my cage door. The next 4 years of my life were a blur, a whirlwind tour of the world's most famous concert halls. London, Paris, Vienna, Rome. I lived in a succession of luxurious, anonymous hotel rooms. My life was a rigid, unchanging schedule of practice, performance, travel, and more practice. I was a global star, a celebrated artist, the toast of the classical music world. And I was more miserable than I had ever been in my life. The piano had become my enemy. The keyboard was a landscape of torment, the applause, the adulation, the roses thrown at my feet, it was all for a person who didn't exist. They were cheering for a passionate, brilliant artist, but I was a fraud. The great secret I had to keep from the world was that I had come to hate the music. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rainy night in Vienna. I was 17. I had just finished another sold-out performance at the Musikverein, another technically perfect rendition of a program that made me feel nothing. I was back in my hotel suite, the rave reviews from the morning papers already laid out on the table by my mother. I was sitting in silence, staring out the window at the glittering, rain-slicked streets of a city I had seen only from the back of a limousine. My father was on the phone with Wexler, excitedly planning the next leg of the tour, the next recording. I looked down at my hands, the source of all this success, all this misery. They were resting in my lap, pale and still. And then it started, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in my right hand, a tiny, involuntary twitch of my little finger. I watched, fascinated and horrified, as the tremor grew, spreading up my wrist, my entire hand beginning to shake with a quiet, uncontrollable violence. My father finished his call. "Right," he said cheerfully, "but Kyo is next." He saw my hand. "Lillian, what's wrong with your hand? Stop that." "I can't," I whispered. The shaking was getting worse, a visible physical manifestation of the silent scream that had been trapped inside me for years. It was a rebellion. My hands, the 2 loyal soldiers who had served his ambitions so flawlessly for so long, were finally, terrifyingly, starting to fight back. The tremor in my hand was the first shot fired in a long and silent civil war. It was a mutiny, my own body declaring independence from the tyranny of my father's ambition. At first, it was a secret I kept even from myself. I would clench my fist, hide my hand in my pocket, praying for the shaking to stop. But the rebellion grew. The tremor would appear without warning, during a difficult passage, in a press photograph, or simply when I looked at a piano. My father's initial reaction was a sharp, angry denial. "It's a weakness, Lillian," he would hiss at me in the privacy of our hotel rooms. "A lack of discipline. You will control it. You will conquer it." He saw it not as a symptom of my suffering, but as a flaw in his perfect machine, a mechanical glitch that could be fixed with more pressure, more practice, more will. But it only grew worse. Our world tour, which should have been a triumphant victory lap, devolved into a desperate, secret search for a cure. We embarked on a second shadow tour of the most exclusive and expensive doctors in Europe. In Zurich, a stern-faced neurologist attached electrodes to my arms and head, frowned at the results, and declared there was nothing physically wrong. In Paris, a renowned physician specializing in musicians' injuries prescribed a series of painful cortisone shots in my wrist that did nothing to stop the shaking. In London, a doctor gently suggested the problem might be psychological, that the immense pressure might be causing performance anxiety. My father was so enraged by this suggestion that he stormed out of the office, dragging me behind him. To admit the problem was in my mind was to admit that he was the cause. It was a truth he would never, ever face. He needed my hands to be broken, not my spirit, because a broken machine can be fixed, but a broken child was an indictment of the man who had made her dot the crack. S began to show in public. The music critics, who had once praised my flawless technique, began to write in a new, more concerned tone. They wrote of a new, nervous energy in my playing. They noted a surprising number of uncharacteristic slips during a Mozart sonata. They described my stage presence as brittle and haunted. Each review was a fresh lash of the whip for my father. The sicker I became, the harder he pushed me. The practice hours grew longer, the sessions more intense. Our hotel suites, once silent except for the music, were now filled with his constant hectoring voice, a relentless barrage of criticism and demands for perfection. I was trapped in a feedback loop of horror. The more I feared the tremor, the more it appeared, and the more it appeared, the more he pushed me, and the more he pushed me, the more I feared. It was my mother who first showed a crack in her own perfect facade of maternal pride. She was the one who saw me late at night, unable to sleep, pacing the floor. She was the one who saw me push my food around my plate, my appetite completely gone. She saw the terror in my eyes before a performance. The years of complicity began to weigh on her. She started with small acts of defiance. She would insist I take a break from practice for an hour. "She needs to rest, Richard," she'd say, her voice trembling but firm. "Look at her. She's pale as a ghost." My father would rage at her, accusing her of being soft, of undermining my discipline. Their hushed, angry arguments became the new soundtrack to my life. Replacing the metronome dot, the final catastrophic battle of my career was fought in London. I was scheduled to perform Rachmaninoff's notoriously difficult Third Piano Concerto at the Royal Albert Hall with the London Philharmonic. In the weeks leading up to it, my condition had deteriorated rapidly. The tremor was now a constant, violent shaking. I couldn't hold a fork, let alone command a keyboard. I was living in a state of pure, unending panic. The night of the concert, I sat in my dressing room, a ghost in a gown, staring at my own reflection in the mirror. I saw a 17-year-old girl who looked 40, her eyes wide with a terror that was bone deep. I could not do it. The thought of walking onto that stage, of facing that enormous, expectant crowd, of putting my traitorous hands on that keyboard was a physical impossibility. My father came in, his face a mask of tense excitement. "It's time," he said. I turned to him, and for the first time in my life, I spoke my own undiluted truth. "No," I said. I can't play. My hands..." I held them out. They were shaking so violently it looked as though I was being electrocuted. His face contorted, not with concert, but with a blind, selfish fury. "Don't you dare do this to me," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Don't you dare throw away everything we've worked for because of a childish fit of nerves. There are thousands of people out there. Wexler will sue us for every penny we have. You will walk out on that stage and you will play that concerto if I have to drag you there myself." He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. And then something miraculous happened. My mother, my quiet, timid, enabling mother, stepped between us. "Stop it, Richard," she said, her voice shaking, but full of a strength I had never heard before. "Leave her alone. Can't you see what you've done to her? Look at her. She's not an artist. She's a terrified child, and she is breaking." It was the first time anyone had ever defended me, the first time anyone had ever named the truth of my existence. The shock of it momentarily stunned my father into silence. In that moment of quiet, in the space created by my mother's courage, I found my own. I looked at my father, at his face, contorted with rage and desperation, and I no longer saw a God whose approval I craved. I saw a sad, broken man, a man who had sacrificed his own daughter to the ghost of his own failure. And I was done. I would not be his sacrifice any longer. I stood up, smoothed down my gown, and walked out of the dressing room. My father thought he had won. A triumphant, cruel smile crossed his face. He and my mother followed me as I walked down the long corridor towards the stage. I could hear the roar of the expectant crowd. I reached the edge of the curtain. I took one last look at my father, and then I walked out into the light dot. The applause was deafening. I walked to the center of the stage, to the magnificent, gleaming black piano that was waiting like an instrument of torture. I bowed to the audience. I sat down on the bench. A profound hush fell over the enormous hall. I placed my hands over the keys. They were perfectly still. I looked at them, and they felt for the first time like my own. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I began to play. The opening bars of the concerto, a piece of music I knew as well as my own name, flowed from my fingers, flawless, powerful, and note-perfect. I played for perhaps 30 seconds, and then I stopped. I lifted my hands from the keys and placed them in my lap. I looked out at the confused, silent sea of faces. I looked at the shocked face of the conductor, his baton frozen in midair. I looked into the wings and saw my father's face, a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. I did not cry. I did not offer an explanation. I simply stood up from the piano bench, gave a small, deliberate, and final bow to the stunned audience, and walked off the stage. The sound of 1,000 people gasping as one was the first true applause I had ever earned. The chaos backstage was immediate and absolute. My manager, Wexler, was screaming about breach of contract, about being ruined. My father was a silent, white-faced statue of pure, catatonic rage. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a monster he had created but could no longer control. In the eye of this hurricane, my mother was an island of calm. She took my arm. "Come with me," she whispered. While my father and Wexler were locked in a frantic, screaming argument, she guided me out a side door into the cool, damp London night. She hailed a taxi. She pressed a thick wad of cash into my hand, her own emergency money, her secret savings. "Go, Lillian," she said, her eyes full of a lifetime of regret and a final, desperate act of love. "Get on a train, go anywhere, just be free, be a little girl." She kissed my forehead, pushed me into the cab, and shut the door. I looked back through the rear window as the taxi pulled away. I saw my mother standing alone on the wet pavement, a small, solitary figure under the bright lights of the concert hall. She was watching me go. I was 17 years old. The greatest piano prodigy of my generation had just committed career suicide in the most public way imaginable. I had nothing but a small bag, a wad of cash, and a future that was a complete and terrifying blank. I looked down at my hands, resting peacefully in my lap. They were not shaking. They were finally, blessedly, still. The taxi sped through the rainy London streets, and with every mile I felt the life of Lillian Vance, the prodigy, receding behind me like a bad dream. I was nobody now, a 17-year-old girl with a wad of cash in her pocket, a single small bag, and a name that had, in the space of 10 minutes, become infamous. The next morning, the headlines of every newspaper in Europe screamed with the story of my dramatic on-stage collapse. They called it a nervous breakdown, a tragic case of burnout. Pundits and psychologists debated the immense pressures placed on gifted children. I read it all with a strange clinical detachment in a small cafe in Paris, a city I'd flown to on the first available flight. They were all writing my obituary, the obituary of a career, of a talent, of a girl. They had no idea they were actually writing the story of my birth. For the next year, I became a ghost. I drifted through Europe, from city to city, deliberately shedding the last remnants of my old life. I had my long hair cut short and spiky, a shocking, liberating act. I traded my elegant, tailored clothes for simple, anonymous jeans and sweaters. I was on a pilgrimage not to see the great cathedrals or museums, but to discover the simple, ordinary world I had been denied. I learned how to order a coffee, how to navigate a subway, how to get lost and find my way again. For the first time, I was not on a schedule. My days were beautifully, terrifyingly empty, a blank sheet of music waiting for notes to be written. The money my mother had given me was a generous gift, and I lived on it sparingly, staying in cheap hostels and eating bread and cheese. It was the most alive I had ever felt. Eventually, I knew I had to find a place to stop, a place to simply be. I chose a small, quiet town in the green mountains of Vermont. It was the furthest I could imagine from the grand concert halls of Vienna and Paris. I used the last of my money to rent a small room above a bookstore. And for the first time in my adult life, I had to find a job with no formal high school diploma and no skills other than the one I had so spectacularly renounced. My options were limited. I found work as a baker's assistant, waking up at 4 a.m. to knead dough and scrub floors. The work was hard, physical, and blessedly mindless. It was honest. My hands, which had once been treated like priceless artifacts, were now covered in flour and calloused from work. They had never felt more like my own. For years, I lived in a world of self-imposed silence when it came to music. The very sight of a piano in a church hall or a school auditorium would send a jolt of anxiety through me. The sound of a classical piece on the radio would make me leave the room. The music was not a source of beauty, it was the language of my trauma, the soundtrack of my father's ambition. I needed to heal, and healing required a profound and absolute quiet. I built a small, simple life in that Vermont town. I made a few friends, I learned to ski and to garden. I was just Lillian, the quiet woman who worked at the bakery. No one knew my past. I was a story without a beginning, and I was content with that. The turning point, my quiet reconciliation with the ghost in my life, came a decade after my escape. I was 27 years old, our town's small community center was raising money for a new roof, and they held a rummage sale. I was browsing the tables of old furniture and discarded kitchenware when I saw it. A small, battered spinet piano, its wood scarred, a few of its keys yellowed and chipped. The sight of it didn't trigger panic, it triggered a strange, quiet curiosity. On a whim, I paid the $10 they were asking for it, and with the help of a friend, hauled it back to my small apartment. It sat in my living room for a month, a silent, hulking presence. I would walk past it, sometimes touching the dusty wood, but never the keys. Then one evening, I sat down on the rickety bench. My hands, which had been so steady for 10 years, began to tremble. Not with the violent psychosomatic tremor of my past, but with a simple human fear. I hesitantly reached out and touched a single key, middle C. The note was out of tune, a dull, thudding sound, but it was a note I had produced of my own free will. I played another, then another. I didn't play a sonata. I picked out, note by painstaking note, the melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the first tune I had ever played, the song that had been the overture to my life's great tragedy. And as I played that simple, childish melody, I began to weep. I cried for the little girl who had never been allowed to just play, for the teenager whose gift had been turned into a weapon against her. I cried until I had no tears left. That night was the beginning of my true musical education. I was not reclaiming a career, I was reclaiming a joy. I played for myself and only for myself. I played simple folk songs, popular tunes from the radio, the carols I had heard at Christmas. I played badly, my fingers clumsy and slow after. A decade of disuse, but it didn't matter. The music was messy and imperfect and joyful and mine. My hands, which my father had said belonged to the music, were finally being used to set my own soul free. This was the secret I kept. The world-famous Lillian Vance had not had a breakdown. She had staged a brilliant escape to find a life where she could play chopsticks. With a happy heart. My new life's work found me. The children in my apartment building heard the simple, happy music coming from my rooms. One of them, a shy little girl named Emily, knocked on my door and asked if I could teach her. I hesitated, then I said yes. That one student became 2, then 4, then 10. I discovered I had a gift, not for performing, but for teaching. I had a profound, intuitive understanding of the fragile connection between a child and their own creativity. I knew how to nurture it, how to protect it from the pressures of perfection. My small apartment became a music studio, and my life found a new, quiet purpose. I never saw my father again. I read his obituary online years later. He had passed away in his late 60s, a bitter and disappointed man who had managed a few local students but had never again come close to the glory he had tasted through me. I felt a quiet, distant sadness for him. My mother, however, found me. When I was in my late 40s, an elderly white-haired woman appeared at my studio door. It was her. She was a widow, and she had spent years trying to track me down. Our reconciliation was not a dramatic, tearful reunion. It was a series of quiet, difficult conversations over many cups of tea. She apologized for her weakness, for her complicity in my father's obsession. I apologized for the pain my public rebellion had caused her. We found a fragile, tentative peace. She spent the last few years of her life in a small cottage near my town, a quiet, doting grandmother to my students, finally finding a way to love me without the blinding glare of ambition. And so, my dear friends, that is my story. It is the story of a girl who was given a great gift that became a great burden and who had to destroy her life in order to save it. It is a testament to the idea that true passion cannot be forced or manufactured. It must be a free and joyful choice. If this story about the immense pressure to succeed and the quiet rebellion of finding one's own joy has spoken to you, I would be so honored if you would subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. There are so many people, young and old, who have had their love for something beautiful tainted by the pressure to be perfect. If Lillian's journey to reclaim her passion resonated with you, I invite you to explore our playlist on stories about finding the courage to start a second life, which is linked in the description below. In the comments, please leave the word joy to let me know you have understood. Odd the true purpose of a gift. Always remember, the most beautiful music is not what you play for the cheering crowds, but the quiet song you play for yourself. Thank you for listening.